Pavel Ivanchuk, you are wrong. Pavel Ivanchuk claims that when Paul says he came not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, Paul was pointing to the life of God himself, active in those who share his nature. That sounds lofty, but Pavel is forcing the text to carry a meaning that isn't there, adding to Paul's words. The first issue is simple. Paul doesn't say, God's life flows in us because we share his nature. He says his preaching rested not on clever human wisdom, but on God's Spirit showing power. Pavel smuggles in a mystical philosophy, almost like we become semi-divine, when Paul was making a much narrower point. That's a textbook case of eisegesis, reading your ideas into the text. Misuse of 2 Peter 1:3-4. Pavel leans heavily on Peter's phrase about being partakers of the divine nature. But Peter doesn't mean we share God's essence. He's talking about moral transformation, escaping the corruption of the world. The divine nature there is holiness, not God's being. To read it the way Pavel does is a category error, confusing ethics with ontology, cherry-picking and proof texting. James 3:13 is also pulled in, but James is dealing with wisdom expressed in good conduct, not spirit power. Quoting it here is classic proof texting, stringing verses together because they sound nice, even though they address different issues. John 15:5 is another example. Jesus teaches dependence, not divine participation. The logic Pavel uses here is faulty. He equates dependence with sharing essence, which is a false equivalence. A false sequence. Pavel lays out a neat sequence. God is the source. We partake, we walk, then power flows. Sounds orderly, but it's a human system imposed on the text. Paul never gave that sequence. Scripture never treats God's power as a formula that flows naturally when we participate. That's more mysticism than Christianity. Biblically, power belongs to God alone, and he works through us as he chooses. The real point Paul was making. The real context of 1 Corinthians 2 is Paul dismantling human pride. Corinth was obsessed with philosophers and skilled orators. Paul stripped that away to show that faith must rest on God's Spirit, not man's cleverness. He wasn't giving a theology of divine essence. He was cutting human boasting off at the knees. My bottom line. Pavel's statement makes Paul sound like a mystic philosopher teaching divine participation, but Paul's actual message was about humility, dependence, and the Spirit's sovereign work. Pavel's essay falls into three major problems: eisegesis, adding meaning; cherry-picking, using unrelated verses; and false equivalence, confusing dependence with essence. Paul didn't preach so people would think they had tapped into God's nature. He preached so people would know the power came from God, not him. Please like, comment, share, and support this channel to learn more.